Alrighty, so one of the most important topics with regards to React. So React components are one of the most important aspects of a React application. They are basically the building blocks for your React application. When you build applications in React, you should always think in terms of components. The idea is to think about your application as a combination of components that may or may not be related to each other. Using components, you can split the user interface into reusable and independent pieces. Lastly, components can also be thought of as functions that return React elements. Moving to this diagram that we saw earlier, our entire user interface can be divided into components. Each component plays a specialized role in this case. For example, the header component takes care of the application header functionality. The sidebar component takes care of the sidebar functionality. Each component can also be further subdivided into one or more smaller components depending on the needs of your application. Moving on, there are two different types of components which you can have in React. The first of them is the class components, which I would say are the more common type of components that are used throughout the industry. And the second one is functional components, which started more as a secondary afterthought, but over time it has also grown in popularity. We will be looking at both of these type of components in great detail along with examples. Alright, so time to look at some code now. So we have our demo application over here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first create a class component. And to do that, I'm going to click on this Explorer tab over here and open the folder view. And within the source directory as well, I will be creating another file. And I will name it my first class component .js. Now the first thing that you have to do while creating a new component is to import React. So we will be doing import React from React like so. And then we will be writing our class definition. So class my first, let me just close this one down so that it looks more clear. So class my first class component, and this is going to extend React component like so. And then inside the class component or the class definition, we need to have one method, and that is the render method. This render method is going to return some amount of JSX. So we have return like so, and for timing we can just have a division, and inside that division I'll just put up a message, hello from my first class component like so. So important point to note here is that this render method is mandatory in a class component. So if you have a class component, you need to have at least one render method. And now we are seeing a little bit of a warning. So that means the reason for that is that we have never used this function. So what we have to do is we have to export this from our file. So export default my first class component. And due to this statement, now we can use this component in other files. So let's see how we do that. So I'll just save this one, and then I'll go to app.js, and inside app.js I'm going to remove this paragraph tag, and instead we are going to replace it with our new class component. So I'll remove it, and I will be putting the class component over here like so. So when I start typing, there is suggestion provided by the editor, and this is my first class component, and I'll just press it. And so two things happened here. So as soon as I pressed enter on that suggestion, this import statement came here automatically. So what it says is import my first class component from my first class component file. And the reason this happened was because of this export statement. If we had not exported this class from the my first class component.js file, we couldn't have imported it over here. So that is why that export statement is very important. So once we have done that, we can now save the app.js file as well. And now I'm going to do npm start. And this is going to start my application. So if I go to Chrome now, I can see the hello message coming from the class component, hello from my first class component. And this is exactly in line with what we have put up over here. So this is an example of a class component. In the next section, we are going to look at the same thing in a functional component. So let's look at a functional component now. So we'll leave this class component as it is. I will just close this window and I'm going to go back to the folder structure and I'm going to create another file and I'll name it my first functional component.js. Again here, like the class component, we will be first importing React. So this React package is mandatory if you want to use React in your files. And next what we'll be doing is writing the functional component. So the name will be function my first functional component, and inside this functional component I just need to have a return statement. So return div and hello from functional component, or I'll just elaborate it a bit more, hello from my first functional component. And again there's a little warning. To remove that, we have to again export this function from the file like so. Accidentally put it as class component, so export default my functional component. So we remove the export statement. So this is basically a functional component, and as you can notice, the important point over here is that there is no render method over here. So if you compare this with your class components, let's open that side by side. So if you see the class component, you have a render method, and within that render method you have the return statement. Whereas in a functional component, you directly just have a return statement. So basically functional components are essentially JavaScript functions that return some JSX. Now before the arrival of something known as React hooks, functional components were also known as stateless components. If you don't know much about state, don't worry, we will be covering that in the future videos. And if you also don't know much about React hooks, also don't worry, we will be covering those in great detail in future videos. So with this examples, we can basically see the difference between class components and functional components. Let's render it now. So to use this functional component, we can again go back to our app.js, and just below the class component, we could put our functional component, my first functional component, like so. And if I save it now, our application is going to refresh. And if I go back to the browser, I can see the message coming from the functional component. So basically our app component, which by the way is a functional component itself, is using one class component and one functional component, and that is perfectly fine. In your application, you will typically be using a mixture of class components and functional components depending on your need. And you will always be mixing and matching these things. So basically with this, we have seen the difference between class components and functional components. In the next video, we will be looking at props and how props can be used in class and functional components. So until then, stay tuned.